1830, the world moved at the speed of a horse. Letters took weeks. News traveled slower. Most people lived and died within 20 miles of where they were born. There were no telephones, no electric lights, no computers to model traffic flow or predict demand. Engineering was not yet a profession in the modern sense. It was a craft, learned through apprenticeship. Calculations were done by hand, on paper, checked and rechecked by candlelight. The tools available were simple: levels, transits, chains for measuring distance. A surveyor could spend months mapping a single railway route. Steam power was new. The first passenger railway, the Liverpool and Manchester, opened in 1830. It carried 500,000 passengers in its first year, a number that astonished everyone involved. But even that success could not have predicted what came next. By the 1850s, cities across Europe and North America were building train stations. Not small depots, not simple platforms, cathedrals. 1850s, cities across Europe and North America were building train stations. Not small depots, not simple platforms, cathedrals of iron and glass. St. Pancras Station in London, completed in 1868, a single-span iron roof covering 689 feet in length and 240 feet in width, the largest single-span roof in the world at the time. Grand Central Depot in New York opened in 1771. The original structure, before the later rebuild, already contained multiple levels, dozens of tracks, vast waiting halls designed for crowds that did not yet exist. Gare du Nord in Paris opened in 1864, designed to handle 200 trains per day in a city where most people still traveled by foot or horse-drawn carriage. These were not modest projects. They were among the largest enclosed public spaces ever constructed, and they were built decades before the traffic they anticipated. Here is where the questions begin. Not accusations, not conspiracy, just simple arithmetic. In 1850, London's population was roughly 2 million. The city had omnibuses and private carriages, but most people walked. Railways were primarily for intercity travel, for the merchant class, the military, the mail. Yet St. Pancras was designed with platforms wide enough to accommodate thousands, ceilings high enough to disperse the smoke of dozens of locomotives running simultaneously. Circulation patterns meant to channel crowds that wouldn't materialize for another generation. Philadelphia's Broad Street Station, opened in 1881, was built with 16 tracks. The city's population was just over 800,000. The surrounding region was largely agricultural. Who calculated that this was necessary? More importantly, how? Modern infrastructure planning relies on data. Traffic studies, population projections, computer modeling, demographic trends analyzed over years. None of this existed in the 1850s. How? Modern infrastructure planning relies on data. Traffic studies, population projections, computer modeling, demographic trends analyzed over years. None of this existed in the 1850s. Engineers had only observation and intuition. They could count existing passengers, they could estimate growth based on recent trends, but predicting demand 30 or 40 years into the future required a kind of faith. And yet the scale they chose was almost always correct. Too large for their present, just right for their future. This suggests either extraordinary foresight or access to a planning framework we no longer understand. Consider the physical construction. St. Pancras required 9,000 tons of iron for the physical construction. St. Pancras required 9,000 tons of iron for its roof. The Midland Railway Company ordered custom wrought iron ribs from the Butterley Ironworks in Derbyshire, each one transported by canal and rail to London. They were lifted into place by human labor, teams of men with ropes and pulleys, coordinated by foremen who could not radio instructions or consult digital blueprints. The floor of the station was built over a subterranean level designed to store beer barrels, thousands of them, shipped in from Burton-on-Trent. This lower level was not an afterthought. It was part of the original design, planned before the first iron beam was raised. Someone imagined all of this before it existed. Someone calculated the loads, the stresses, the flow of goods and people through multiple levels of a structure that had never been built before. And they did it with pencil and paper. The crew creations were not specialists, at least in the way we understand the term. They were called navvies, short for navigators, men who had dug the canals before the railways came. They worked with hand tools, shovels, pickaxes, wheelbarrows, explosives for cutting through rock, but no mechanical excavators. A single railway cutting could require the removal of millions of cubic yards of earth, all of it dug by hand, hauled away in carts pulled by horses. The work was dangerous. Men died regularly, crushed by falling stone, killed in explosions, buried in collapsed trenches, yet the pace of construction was relentless. The Thames Tunnel, the world's first underwater tunnel, was completed in 1843 after 18 years of work. But by the 1860s, railway tunnels were being driven through mountains in a fraction of the time. How did the efficiency improve so rapidly? The train station required simultaneous work on multiple fronts: foundation excavation, masonry, ironwork, glazing, interior finishing. Each phase depended on the others. Delays in one area cascaded through the entire. All of this had to be managed without telephones, without radios, without site-wide communication systems. Instructions were delivered by messenger. Changes to plans required meetings, new drawings, couriers dispatched across the city. And yet, these projects were completed on schedules that seem impossible even today. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Broad Street Station was designed, approved, and constructed in under 3 years. By comparison, modern train station renovations with computer-aided design, prefabricated materials, and mechanized construction often take a decade or more. Something about the organizational capacity of the 19th century is missing from the standard historical narrative. There is a reason these buildings feel unsettling to modern eyes. We have been taught that progress is linear, that each generation builds on the last with better tools, better methods, better results. But standing in a 19th century train station disrupts that narrative. The space feels too grand, too confident, too complete. We see the finished product, the soaring ceilings, the ornate ironwork, the sheer scale, but we have lost the context of how it was made. Our education skips over the details. We learn that the Industrial Revolution happened. We learn that cities grew, but we don't learn the mechanics of mass labor coordination. We don't learn how engineers made decisions without the data we consider essential. And so the buildings feel impossible. This feeling has a name now in certain corners of the internet. The term Tartarian appears in online discussions about 19th century architecture. It is not a historical term. It does not refer to a real empire. The name comes from Tartary, a vague geographical designation used by European mapmakers for the vast, poorly understood regions of Central Asia. Over time, in certain communities, the word has been repurposed. People use it as shorthand for a type of architecture, grand, symmetrical, built to a scale that seems incongruent with the society that supposedly produced it. The term is not scientific, it is not endorsed by historians or archaeologists, but it persists because it names a feeling, the sense that something about the official story is incomplete. Not wrong necessarily, just incomplete. Why do people reach for alternative explanations? Because the standard narrative has gaps. We are told that these buildings were built by 19th century engineers using 19th century tools, but the how is often glossed over. How did they calculate the loads on an iron arch before computers? How did they organize thousands of workers without modern communication systems? How did they predict traffic levels before statistical modeling? The answers exist. They are in the archives, in construction logs, engineering journals, company records, but they are not part of the popular understanding of history. And so when someone stands in St. Pancras or Grand Central and feels that sense of impossible scale, they have no framework for understanding it. The mystery is not that the buildings were built. The mystery is that we have forgotten how to imagine the people who built them. Consider a modern comparison. In the early 2000s, Berlin began planning a new central train station.
Consider a modern comparison. In the early 2000s, Berlin began planning a new central train station. The site was cleared. The designs were approved. Construction began in 1998. The station opened in 2006. 8 years for a project with computer-aided design, prefabrication, cranes, and modern logistics. Contrast that with St. Pancras, designed in 1865 and opened in 1868. 3 years start to finish. Of course, the comparison is not entirely fair. Modern projects face regulations, environmental reviews, labor laws that did not exist in the 19th century. But even accounting for those differences, the pace feels reversed. Why could the Victorians build faster with less? Perhaps because there was no bureaucracy to slow them, no lengthy approval processes, no environmental impact statements. Or perhaps because the organizational methods they used, site foremen with absolute authority, direct communication chains, and acceptance of risk, have been replaced by systems that prioritize safety and compliance over speed. There is no judgment in this observation, only the question: what did they understand about construction that we have since forgotten? Act 12, the railway as a system. It is important to remember that the stations were not built in isolation. They were nodes in a network, a system that required simultaneous construction across hundreds of miles. Tracks had to be laid, bridges had to be built, tunnels had to be dug, signal systems had to be installed, timetables had to be coordinated. All of this happened at once in the 1840s and 1850s across multiple countries. In Britain alone, over 6,000 miles of railway were built between 1830 and 1850. That is an average of 300 miles per year by hand. The scale of coordination required is staggering, and yet it was achieved by companies working independently, often in competition, with no central planning authority. How? Perhaps the real mystery is not the buildings themselves. Perhaps it is the human capacity for large-scale organization. We assume because we have better tools, we are more capable. But the Victorians built train stations, sewer systems, bridges, and tunnels that are still in use today. They did it faster than we do now, and they did it without the technologies we consider essential. This suggests that the limiting factor in construction is not tools, it is will and organizational clarity. The 19th century had both. Whether we do is an open question. Act 14. The stations today. Walk through St. Pancras today. The iron arches are still there, the platforms are still in use, but now the station is filled with coffee shops and luxury retailers. The spaces designed for crowds of travelers are shared with tourists taking photographs. The building has outlasted its original purpose and found new ones. It has become a monument to a kind of confidence we no longer possess. Not the confidence that comes from knowing the future, but the confidence to build for it anyway. Stand again in that empty train station. Ask the question again, who was all this for? Maybe the answer is simpler than we think. Not a lost civilization, not hidden knowledge, just people who believed the world would grow and who built accordingly. The mystery is not what they knew, it is what we have forgotten about scale, about labor, about the capacity of human beings to coordinate and create. The stations remain. The question remains, what did they see that we no longer do?